Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Rockefeller Center. We're pleased to welcome Professor Catharine A. MacKinnon and Saru Jayaraman discussing the subminimum wage for tip workers. Before we get started, a couple of Zoom details. Ask your questions at any time by using the Q&A button, and a reminder that the earlier that you ask your questions, the greater the likelihood that they will get answered. And to access Zoom's closed captioning feature, navigate to the live transcript button and select Show Subtitle. And if you don't see that option, look under the More button. Finally, when you leave tonight's webinar, you will see a survey. We'd be very grateful to you if you would take the time to answer the 3 questions that are there. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our host for the evening, Susan Brison. She's the Eunice and Julian Cohen Professor for the Study of Ethics and Human Values and Professor of Philosophy at Dartmouth. I'm sorry for mangling your title, Professor Brison. Thank you so much for being our host tonight.
Just fine. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Joanne. I'm just thrilled to be here moderating this event on the tipping point, how the subminimum wage for tip workers keeps incomes low and sexual harassment high in the US restaurant industry. There's currently a national debate on the issue of raising the federal minimum wage, and within the federal bill that's being considered is a proposal to end the subminimum wage for tipped workers, currently just $2.13 an hour. Today, we'll hear from experts on this issue regarding the history of the subminimum wage and its impact on a workforce that is overwhelmingly women and disproportionately women of color. We'll especially delve into the impacts on women with regard to their economic security and experiences of sexual harassment. First, I'll introduce our 2 speakers. Then, before we hear from them, we'll hear brief testimonials from a directly impacted tip worker and a restaurant owner here in New Hampshire. Professor Saru Jayaraman is professor of One Fair Wage and director of the Food Labor Research Center at University of California, Berkeley, where she spent the last 20 years organizing and advocating for raising wages and improving working conditions for restaurant and other service workers. She's a graduate of Yale Law School and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and has been named one of Crane's 40 Under 40, CNN's Top 10 Visionary Women, and the San Francisco Chronicle's Visionary of the Year. She was a recipient of the James Beard Leadership Award and was recognized as a champion of change by the White House in 2014. She has 3 books to her credit. Behind the Kitchen Door came out in 2013 and was praised by Danny Glover as a must-read for anyone who eats at restaurants. I mean, that's everybody, right? In 2016, she published the critically acclaimed national bestseller, Forked, a new standard for American dining. And in 2020, she published a co-edited volume entitled Bite Back, People Taking on Corporate Food and Winning. Professor Catharine A. MacKinnon is Elizabeth A. Long Professor of Law at the University of Michigan, and since 2009 has also been teaching at Harvard as the James Barr Ames Visiting Professor of Law. She's also taught at numerous law schools in the US and around the world. I think she's taught on just about every continent except Antarctica. She holds a BA from Smith College, a JD from Yale Law School, and a PhD in political science from Yale. And while she was still in law school, she began her life's work of changing the legal landscape in the US and globally. She developed her groundbreaking view that what she termed sexual harassment was not just life for countless women in the workplace, but a legally actionable harm. And then she literally wrote the book on it, publishing in 1979, Sexual Harassment of Working Women, a Case of Sex Discrimination. Professor MacKinnon not only pioneered the legal claim for sexual harassment in the US, but with Andrea Dworkin created ordinances recognizing pornography as a civil rights violation and proposed the Swedish model for abolishing prostitution. Her approaches to equality, pornography, and hate speech have been influential internationally. And representing Bosnian women survivors of Serbian genocidal sexual atrocities, she established the first legal recognition of rape as an act of genocide. She also served as the first special gender advisor to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague from 2008 to 2012. She's widely published in scholarly journals and in the popular press, and is one of the most widely cited legal scholars in the English language, and over time, the most widely cited woman. She's published 13 scholarly books. I think I've read all of them, but I'm certain I've read most of them. And so I have firsthand evidence that they're brilliant. I've already mentioned her first book, and I'll end by mentioning her latest, Butterfly Politics, which proposes a theory of social change through law by reflecting on her scholarship and activism over the past 4 decades. Now, this is where I would normally ask you to join me in welcoming our distinguished guests, and we'd hear thunderous applause, but we can't even see you now, let alone hear you. So now I'm going to introduce 2 people who will be speaking in very short 2-minute videos. First is Kimberly Talioderosis, who is a longtime service industry worker from Manchester, New Hampshire, who's also worked in Maine and Massachusetts as a tip worker at Denny's. She's been a leader in the fight for one fair wage since 2016 to improve working conditions and wages for her peers in the service industry. She's been featured in USA Today, the Maine Free Press, and other outlets for her advocacy efforts. Second, based in Keene, New Hampshire, Gail Summers is the owner of Yasso Jamaican Grill. Gail is a leader in RAISE, High Road Restaurants, a small business employer association of over 1,000 independently owned restaurants committed to improving jobs in the restaurant industry. She also serves on several boards and committees, such as the Keene Racial Justice and Safety Committee and the Monadnock Area Transitional Shelter, all causes she is very passionate about. So here will be the videos.
My name is Kimberly Taliodoris. I am from Southern New Hampshire. I have worked in the restaurant industry for 22 years as a server. I've always been paid the state's sub-minimum wage, which in New Hampshire, that is $3.27 an hour. I've never seen a restaurant pay any tipped worker any more than the legal obligation, which is tipped minimum. I have been working in this pandemic since we reopened in June of 2020 with decreased hours and a significant increase to my workload. We have to wear gloves most of the time. We always wear masks. We also have just reopened our extensive patio that was built for the pandemic, which is on pavement, and it is very hot out there in the summer, upwards over 100 degrees on some days last July. Our tip percentages are down. The verbal harassment from customers is at a level I have never seen in 22 years. This leads me to getting engaged and voicing for the industry's need for one fair wage. I've been talking to colleagues throughout New Hampshire and in Maine that all just don't see returning back to the industry without better wages. Many have left for other industries. They promise better wages, less health risks through public exposure, and without the added stress of having to work for tips. Every day the situation gets worse as more employees find jobs outside the industry and restaurants continue to be short-staffed. That staffing issue is getting worse as we reopen patios for the summer season and business increases. We don't have a worker shortage. It's not the problem. The problem is the wages. We have a wage shortage and restaurant workers aren't going to take it anymore. One Fair Wage has shown through their research that fair wages are key to keeping employees. In a recent poll, 80% of my colleagues in New Hampshire have said that a $15 minimum wage with tips on top would make them stay in the industry, and it would be a deciding factor on whether they leave altogether. If we are able to win a full minimum wage, we wouldn't be so heavily reliant on customer tips. The aggression and hostility has always existed, but with the pandemic, it's intolerable. My employers following guidelines has made me, a server, a target for their political opinions, their anger, and their hostility. And these are the very people who I rely on for my income, for my tips. I'm harassed to remove my mask for a better tip because I'm a woman. I'm required to follow policies to keep myself and my customers safe at the expense of losing tips from customers who disagree with these policies. In closing, One Fair Wage will help make a better industry for all of us, and it will make a better working environment for everyone. And it will hopefully keep New Hampshire's restaurants that are struggling survive and see out the end of this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm a small business owner from New Hampshire. I'm a leader in the Raise High Road Restaurants, an association of over 850 restaurants that support the one fair wage, a full minimum wage with tips on top. I believe in paying a full minimum wage with tips on top. If I can make it work as a small business owner, then I think all the fine dining restaurants and big corporate chain restaurants can make it work as well. Most tip workers don't work in fine dining restaurants. A lot of them work in casual restaurants like mine, where the tips are even less. And most of them need to be paid this full minimum wage with tips on top. Small restaurants need workers in all restaurants, not just casual or fine dining, all restaurants to be paid enough to eat out. Personally, for me, a restaurant is a key part of the community. And as a restaurant owner, I want to know that my employees can afford to eat out at other restaurants. We also need workers to be willing to come back to work, and we can't afford if over 40% of workers leave the industry because tips and wages are too low. I strongly believe that we can make a $15 minimum wage with tips on top work. If wages go up, consumption power goes up. We as restaurant owners are able to raise prices slightly and still enjoy enough profits. A lot of restaurant owners who oppose this may say that it's not going to be profitable for them. I believe strongly that we need to pay and treat people like the professionals they are. We're not advocating for tips to go away. From an equality perspective, having everyone paid a fair wage and allowing tips to be shared between the back of the house and the front of the house is crucial to create equality and camaraderie among the whole staff. Even as a small business owner, whenever major restaurant industry operator gets to pay a sub-minimum wage, that's bad business for me, and it undermines my ability to operate responsible. In order to incentivize high road employers like me who want to do the right thing, the government has to have our back.
Thank you. Professor Jayaraman, let's start with you. When people hear that the federal subminimum wage for tipped workers is still $2.13 an hour, they're shocked. How did the subminimum wage for tipped workers come to be? And how does it work today? Is it $2.13 everywhere across the country?
Thank you, Professor Brison. Thank you, Professor MacKinnon, and thank you to everybody who's here today. It's a very sordid history that brings us to this point of having a $2 wage. So, the restaurant industry has been one of the largest and fastest growing private sector employers in the US, one of the largest employers of women prior to the pandemic, almost 14 million workers, but it's been the lowest paid industry for generations. And that is largely due to the money, power, and influence of a trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association, which really represents the chains, the IHOPs, the Applebee's, the Olive Gardens. And that trade lobby has been around in various forms for over 100 years. It was around in incipient forms at emancipation of slavery, when the industry first demanded the right to hire newly freed slaves, not pay them anything at all, and have them live entirely on this new idea that had just come from Europe at the time called tipping. So at emancipation, the industry mutated the notion of tipping, which had originated in Europe as an extra or bonus on top of a wage. It was mutated to become a replacement for wages to be able to pay a Black workforce nothing and have them live entirely on tips. So this is a direct legacy of slavery, and it really can't be understood as anything other than a devaluation of Black lives, and also a devaluation of women's work, because this was a majority female workforce for a very long time, continues to be today. We went from a $0 wage emancipation, which was made law in 1938, when everybody got the right to the minimum wage for the first time, except for millions of Black workers who are left out, farm workers, domestic workers, and tipped restaurant workers, all Black workers who are left out. So we started with $0 in 1938 when everybody got the right to the minimum wage, and we went up to $2.13 at the federal level and a little over $3 in New Hampshire. So New Hampshire is one of 43 states in the US that persists today with this legacy of slavery. Most of those states, about 40 out of 50 of states, have a wage that is less than $5 an hour, all because over the last 150 years, this lobby has continued to argue that they shouldn't have to pay their workers' wages. No, other people, customers, should pay their workers' wages for them. Now, there are 7 states that have gotten rid of this system altogether: California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska all require a full minimum wage with tips on top. And despite what you hear from the Restaurant Association, we do in fact have restaurants in California. In fact, California is the state with the largest and fastest growing restaurant industry in the US, with a $15 minimum wage and tips on top. All 7 states, in fact, have higher restaurant industry sales, higher job growth, higher small business growth rates than New Hampshire, higher rates of tipping, and here's the clincher for this conversation: 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment in the restaurant industry. Because it turns out when you pay a woman a full minimum wage, she doesn't have to put up with as much from customers. You know, in New Hampshire and the 43 states with the subminimum wage today, you've got a over 2/3 majority female workforce. In fact, New Hampshire is the state with the highest percentage of women in the tipped workforce of any state in the US. 75%, 3/4 of tipped workers in New Hampshire are women. They're mostly women working in very casual restaurants, struggling to make ends meet and struggling with the highest rates of sexual harassment, as Professor MacKinnon will share. I just think it's important to note, this is not how it's done everywhere. 7 states have managed to figure it out and are actually doing much better as a result.
Thank you. So, Professor MacKinnon, you've spent your life as the nation's most renowned legal scholar on sexual harassment. More recently, you've conducted a series of studies on sexual harassment among tip workers. What did you find? Just need to unmute now. There.
Yeah. The studies were conducted with One Fair Wage and with Professor Louise Fitzgerald as well. And our most recent representative national research study of restaurant workers was conducted in January 2021. And there it was confirmed that being forced to rely on tips instead of being paid a real equal wage explains more about sexual harassment. And we also found that changing it would change more about sexual harassment than anything else that we know of. Prior strong research by One Fair Wage showed that restaurants in states with a minimum wage with tips on top have, as Professor Jayaraman mentioned, half the sexual harassment of states with a subminimum, subhuman wage. Now, consistent with that, our new study shows that 76% of women who worked in restaurants where they had to rely on tips were sexually harassed at least once over their working time. Now, that is 76%, people, compared with 52% of those who had a guaranteed wage. As a result of the tipped wage structure, restaurants impose a higher lifetime incidence of sexual harassment on its women workers, who are disproportionately women of color, than any other industry or sector ever studied. And that includes more than schools and, get this, more than the military. Now, tipped workers who are paid a subminimum wage, which is the rule in 4 of 5 states, are also sexually harassed worse and more than minimum wage workers in every way that we measured. We measured aggressive, degrading, intrusive, objectifying, persistent sexual invasions. We measured verbal and physical. And all of this was more for them by men, customers, supervisors, managers, and owners. And if those who it was done to reported it, their situation, if they were a tipped worker, was less likely to be corrected, and they were significantly more retaliated against for reporting that abuse than workers who received a minimum wage. Now, the sexualized misogyny that we found capsulized in what we previously called masculine harassment, and which you heard the worker Kimberly describing, is that in which women, disproportionately women of color, face demands to remove their masks to receive a tip. It's the take it off effect. We found in our new report to extend from being an issue of racial, economic, and gender inequality to a threat to life. The often racist misogyny reported by our subjects that was expressed through the vector of sexuality, specifically of entitled white masculinist sexuality, took advantage of the economic lever of power provided by the tipping dynamic to combine economic with sexual exploitation. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed this non-exceptional one in high relief. It was already there, but made it newly lethal. Now, what to do about this triple threat to women's lives: race, sex and sexuality, poverty, how to intervene against it effectively, how to reduce its incidence, how to prevent even some of it from happening. This has anguished policymakers, scholars, activists, workers for decades. And everyone talks about prevention, but they never say what it will really take actually to prevent it. That's because they don't know. Now, equality, of course, is the real prevention answer, but that has to be delivered across the board on every level. What we found and have found in our work, and was reported to you just now, both by Professor Jayaraman and the worker Kimberly and the owner Gail Summers, was one very deliverable step: paying a minimum wage with tips on top does more than any single solution achieved, proposed, or imagined to significantly reduce sexual harassment in the restaurant industry, where a majority of American women work their first job. Nothing else, including making sexual harassment illegal, I might add, has been shown to be this effective against it.
Oh, thank you. I hadn't gone to a restaurant in the last 14 months. And so I was not even aware of this phenomenon of masculine harassment until learning about it from you and Professor Jayaraman. It's just chilling to me. And the data seem totally compelling. But several elected officials have voted against the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, including our own US senators from New Hampshire, Senators Jean Shaheen and Maggie Hassan. And what they're saying is that they're hearing from small business restaurant owners that they cannot withstand increasing wages, especially during the pandemic. They're also saying that they're hearing from some tipped workers who don't want a full wage. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I'll start by responding, and I appreciate the question because it's so important to dissect what we're hearing from the Restaurant Association. First, I just think it's important to delve a little bit deeper into what Professor MacKinnon was sharing about what happened during the pandemic. So listen, before the pandemic, as we've both shared, this was the industry with the highest rates of sexual harassment. You have women who are, struggling to survive. having to tolerate inappropriate customer behavior to feed their families and tips. That power dynamic between women servers and male customers got so much worse during the pandemic because 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs. 60% couldn't get unemployment insurance because in most states they were told that their wages were too low to qualify for benefits. Now, right now you're hearing in this policy debate nationally, oh, we can't get workers because they're staying home. They're so lazy staying home collecting unemployment insurance. But the vast majority of restaurant workers couldn't even get it. And then they were forced to go back to work last summer before they felt safe. And when they went back to work, what they reported to us, and it's the study Professor MacKinnon referred to, they reported that tips are way down. 70 to 80% of workers said tips are down 50 to 75% because sales are down. And they were asked now to do so much more for so much less. They're asked to enforce social distancing and mask rules, as Kimberly said, on the same customers from whom they have to get tips to survive. And as Professor MacKinnon mentioned, the sexual harassment, 50% of women said sexual harassment went up, mind you, in the industry that already had the highest rates of sexual harassment. And thousands of women reported that they were being asked repeatedly to take off their masks so men could judge their looks and their tips on that basis. So I'm sharing all of this before getting to answering your question because it's so important context to understand that things have gotten so much worse. And as a result, as Kimberly mentioned, our latest research shows that over half, 53% of workers across the country are saying they're leaving the industry, and close to 80% are saying, 78% are saying the only thing that would make them stay is a full livable wage with tips on top. We did a poll specifically of New Hampshire tipped workers with Lake Research Associates. 80% of workers in New Hampshire said they want one fair wage with tips on top. So now let's go to your questions. Okay, if this is what workers want, to answer your second question, actually the vast majority of workers not only are saying they want this, they're saying they're going to leave the industry without it, which is devastating to small businesses. So let's talk about small businesses. Small businesses grow faster in the 7 states with one fair wage than they do in New Hampshire. Why? Because actually, don't believe me, the CFO of Denny's actually admitted in an analyst call to investors in February that their company is growing faster in California than any state in the US because consumer spending is higher in California because the wage is higher. Listen, when you've got the largest and fastest growing workforce in America, so poor, they can't even put food on their own families' tables. They use food stamps at double the rate of the rest of the US workforce. You give them a raise, guess what they're going to do? They're going to go eat out. That's going to support, guess who? Small businesses. And so as Gail said, restaurants like Gail desperately need workers to get enough money to spend. All the relief in the world it's going to be a one-time moment, but to keep restaurants open, you need the working people to be able to afford to spend. So what we know from the data is that small businesses grow faster in states with one fair wage, not slower. They don't close, they grow faster. And even if you think California is an alien planet, as many people do, you can compare New Hampshire to Washington State or Oregon State or Alaska or Montana or Nevada. All of these states have a full minimum wage with tips on top. Minnesota, and the small businesses are growing faster than they are in New Hampshire. But beyond looking at that data, I think the real question now is, how are small businesses going to survive, reopen, if they can't get workers to come work in them? If the majority of workers are saying we're leaving because the wages are too low, there is no way for the restaurant industry to fully reopen. And I'll just close by saying this. I was just talking to a prominent independent restaurant owner, not a chain, on Friday, and they were saying, they're in New York, and they were saying Governor Cuomo in New York is now allowing us to move to 75% indoor dining capacity. But he says, I don't know a single restaurant in New York that can actually go to 75% because there's not enough workers to get to 75%. And if that's true in New York, I know for a fact, because I've looked at the data, that it is true in New Hampshire. Thousands of workers are leaving this industry because, as Kimberly said, it just doesn't add up anymore.
Professor MacKinnon?
Yeah, in our research into the restaurant world, what we have found here is basically the mother lode of sexual harassment, or maybe we should call it the patriarchal load of sexual harassment. And what I think is that it's a different question that these small business owners should be answering. And that is whether the women who work for them absorbing sexual abuse in their workplaces, whether that is essential to their business. Why should their women workers whose work makes their business possible and profitable be forced to pay the cost of this discriminatory condition in their dignity, their integrity, their equality, their humanity, in some cases, their mortality, for the privilege of earning an obscenely less than living wage so that predators can continue to use them? Why? I think that's the question that these small business owners ought to be confronted with, and the one they should answer.
Thank you, Professor MacKinnon. We now have some time for questions, and I see a couple of them have already come in. Bill Platt asks, are you aware that a proposal making its way through the New Hampshire legislature, Senate Bill 137, would freeze the current tipped minimum wage where it is now if the federal government raises the minimum wage? Rather than remaining at 45% of the federal minimum wage, the tipped minimum wage in New Hampshire would be paid at $3.27 per hour. I wasn't aware of this.
Someone should research that, because I don't think that would be legal.
It's
Called
not.
preemption.
Exactly.
Okay,
So someone, it's conceivable that in our legislature, someone may have proposed that, but yes, okay.
No, it's not legal, as Professor MacKinnon said. You can't keep the wage in New Hampshire at $3 if the federal government raises the minimum wage. And that's exactly right. It would be preempted by federal law. So the law would be invalid in its face, basically.
Thank you.
there's a lot more to say about that one, but let's
Okay,
say
well, this is good to know.
war. Yeah, there was a war like fought over stuff like this.
So Paul Wolfson asks, says, I'm an economist at Tuck Business School, and I published on the minimum wage. Getting rid of the tipped subminimum wage will reduce the power imbalance somewhat, but will definitely improve earnings and is a solid deliverable. But so long as tipping is important to servers' earnings, do you think the sexual and racial dynamics between servers and customers will change much? I'm skeptical.
Yeah, I'll start, and then I'm sure Professor MacKinnon can add. I mean, yes, because we've done the research in the 7 states, and what we know that workers tell us, and both has been reported in the quantitative data, is that actually when a woman gets a full minimum wage from her employer, what she's able to do is say no. She definitely gets tips. Tips are plentiful in California on top of a wage, but that is not her only source of income. Listen, when you work in New Hampshire, Kimberly was mentioning you get a little over $3. That wage is so low, it goes entirely to taxes. You do actually live entirely on your tips. Your tips are your almost entire source of income because you don't see the wage at all. It goes to taxes. That means whatever a man says or does to you, you've got to put up with it because the tips are your only source of income. Whereas in California, you get a $15 minimum wage with tips on top. You can count on that wage from your employer, like frankly, every other worker in every other industry. And you don't have to put up with as much from customers because the tips are not your only source of income. You're not so dependent on the tips that you have to put up with whatever the customer does to you. Maybe the clearest example of this is a Congress member that many of you know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, did a Server for an Hour event with us a few years ago where she came back. She was a bartender before she became a Congress member, but she did an event with us where she acted as a server. And in that event, she spoke and said, when you're a server in a state like New York or New Hampshire with a sub-minimum wage, maybe at the beginning of the month, a guy tries to grab you and you can swat his hand away and say, buzz off. She says between the 15th of the month and the end of the month, he does that, you have no choice. You're going to put up with it because that's how you're going to pay your rent and your bills on the first of the next month. So it all comes down to how dependent are you on that tip, that man's tip, how much you're going to put up with. And that's why paying a full minimum wage really reduces the power imbalance between male customers and female servers. But I'd love Professor MacKinnon to weigh in.
Just to underline in somewhat different words the exact same point. First of all, it's a very good question that the questioner asked, because it allows us to make clear that we're not saying that this eliminates sexual harassment. Women are sexually harassed in all occupations, including in those where women are paid equally to men. What we have found, however, is that the tipping dynamic exacerbates that. It increases the power disparity. What appears to happen here is that when a lot of men reach for their wallets to put some money on the table that goes directly to the woman, sex is the first thing they think of. And, you know, it exaggerates this entire dynamic. And, you know, as is the case with all sexual harassment that is unremedied, it's a prostitution-like dynamic. It happens to women in all occupations. You know, what it means is you have to sexually deliver in order to survive economically. If sexual harassment is not remedied, that is what it is. And so, you know, when there's a possibility of doing something about it legally, that does help. But here, it's, you know, he's pulling out the money and he's putting it there. And then he says, you know, take it off so I can see if you're worth it. And it exaggerates all of the power dynamics that both pre-exist and continue to exist. But this is a piece of power that we can give women. And, you know, the fact is, this is something we can do something about. There's a lot that can be done about the way male dominance promotes sexual abuse of women, and the way women have to survive, have to put up with it and tolerate it or deliver on it in order to survive economically. That is the case. But this actually is something that makes a real difference. That is a minimum wage with tips on top.
Thanks. So,
data point.
oh,
Sorry,
go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
MacKinnon said, which I just so brilliant in the way that she describes it. I just want to add one data point, which is when we did the study comparing the 43 states to the 7 states and found that the 7 states had 1/2 the rate of sexual harassment. Another part of that study was that workers in the 43 states reported that their managers encouraged them to dress more sexy, show more cleavage, wear tighter clothing at 3 times the rate that happened in the 7 states with one fair wage, a full minimum wage with tips on top. So precisely to Professor MacKinnon's talking about this dynamic where you're basically being asked to, in some ways, sell your body. I mean, literally, women are being asked to show their body in order to make more money in tips. And when you especially think about the fact that this is a workforce that is 40% under the age of 24. And so this is the first job for so many American women. You know, almost 1 in 2 Americans has worked in this industry at some point in their lifetime. The first job, the job where American young women and men are exposed to the world of work. And if your first job, you're told, dress more sexy, show more cleavage, wear tighter clothing in order to make more money in tips, that does set for you in your mind standard for what work is about, or at least the worst that work could ever be. And we have heard from women who say later in life, you know, I've been harassed in my youth and in restaurants, and it was never as bad as it was then. It does have lasting impacts to experience that young in your youth.
It also sets a standard for what women are for. Yeah, I mean, you learn at very young that, you know, what you're being paid for isn't the work you're doing. She's doing the work. You know, it's her sexuality in a way that it can be made accessible to someone who's reaching for his wallet.
I mean, I think many of us have been aware for a long time about this happening at places like Hooters, but you're revealing it. This is a ubiquitous phenomenon. It's not just in a few places. So Mike Holdowski says, why tips on top? Almost all professions and workers work under posted prices. Why not a price without tips, which may be somewhat higher, and have workers receive a fair wage of $17 or so, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the question. I listen, if you go to the MIT living wage MIT puts out a living wage calculator for every region in the United States. And I've looked at it for New Hampshire. I've looked at it for every state. There's pretty much no region, by the way, including West Virginia in the US, where $15 an hour is enough. If you have a child, for example, to cover your basic costs, nowhere in the country. And so if we're talking about a $15 minimum wage, in our opinion, as a workers' rights organization, tips are essential on top of that $15 minimum wage to get people closer to what they need to live. If we were talking about higher wages as they have in Australia or Europe, then perhaps we could answer this question differently. But if we're talking about a $15 minimum wage, we workers absolutely need, I'm sure people who worked in this industry, lived on tips, can tell you $15, we would need the tips on top to get us closer to what we actually need to live and survive and take care of children. So that's how I would answer it. Sure, if we were talking about higher wages, absolutely.
But also notice, here we are having to fight to get a minimum wage. Really? It tells you something about what women are thought of as being worth, and it's, so I love that you're suggesting that we should get paid even more than that, but here we are, having to fight to get a minimum wage, not even an increase. So, hard as it is, I'd love to fight for double that. I'd love to fight for 17. That's excellent. But, we're being told there's a real possibility that we might not even get this.
Yeah, so Edie McGovern writes, I know that in many European countries, it's considered odd or even rude to tip at all. So do you have any thoughts on the difference between that kind of server income system versus the one in California where wages are full, but tips are still accepted and encouraged?
I would love to share this really interesting history about why Europe is like that. It tells something about us as a country. So tipping originated in feudal Europe. It was an extra or bonus that aristocrats gave to serfs or vassals, but always on top of a wage, always as an extra or bonus. If you could watch Downton Abbey or read Old English literature, you see references to tipping as something that a noble or aristocrat would give, extra 20 quid, they would say, for a job well done, on top of a wage. The idea came to the States in the 1850s when something really interesting happened. Before 1853, waiters in most large cities in the US, mainly on the East Coast, because the West was not as developed in 1853, were men, and they were largely white men, and they got a full wage. Actually, there wasn't a lot of tipping at the time because tipping was mainly in Europe, was coming over at the time, and they were mostly men, and they went on strike for higher wages in 1853. And so the restaurant industry, in retaliation to these men going on strike asking for higher wages, decided they wanted to replace these men with, guess who? With women, and then with Black people at emancipation. And so there had been, actually, when tipping first came to the US, there had been huge pushback against it. There were 6 states that actually banned tipping in the US. Americans said, there was a big populist movement. Americans said tipping is anti-democratic. It's a vestige of feudalism. You should get good service regardless of how much you can afford to tip. And by the way, employers should pay workers, not customers. And that anti-tipping movement, that populist movement, spread to Europe, The labor movement picked it up in Europe, and with the rallying cry, we are professionals. We don't need to live on the largesse of customers. This is an antiquated feudal system. And that is why when you go to Europe, it is considered a bit rude to tip, because people say, I'm a professional. I don't live off your largesse or your biases, frankly, because now it's irrefutable. Not only does tipping result in sexual harassment, as we've talked about, but immense amounts of racial bias. I mean, there's a professor at Cornell who spent his whole life studying this, Michael Lynn, and it is now irrefutable, mountains of evidence that servers of color get less than white servers, even when they provide what's called perfect service, because of the implicit bias of customers. So European workers perhaps innately know that tipping is biased on any number of factors and said, we're professionals, we don't rely on your tips. But in the US, we went in the exact opposite direction because of slavery, because they wanted to replace men with women, because of the devaluation of Black people and women's worth. That is why we rejected this populist movement that started here and spread to Europe. So I would say, again, I think this is a long-term fight. We need to first fight, as Professor MacKinnon said, for just a minimum wage with tips on top. That is a huge fight. We need to win it. And once we do, I think we can start moving towards this idea that we are professionals. We are skilled professionals in the restaurant industry. We deserve full livable incomes like other professionals. And so one step at a time, basically. Professor Brison, I think you're muted.
Thank you. I was typing and didn't want the noise to come through. So Selena has a comment rather than a question. She says, side work, cleaning, filling condiment containers, setting tables, etc., are paid at the sub-minimum wage also. This is wage theft. Did you have any comments about that?
I was muted.
It's contagious. I'm sorry, I started it.
Oh my gosh, Selena, thank you so much for raising that, because we didn't get to it at all. One of the major arguments of the Restaurant Association is that nobody actually earns $2 or $3. Everybody gets tips. And don't worry, because there's a law that requires employers to ensure that tips bring you to the full minimum wage. Otherwise, guess what? The employer has to make up that difference. Well, under the Obama administration, that we saw the highest levels of government enforcement of this rule, and the Obama administration found an 84% violation rate with regard to employers actually complying and making up the difference. And the Solicitor General of the US Department of Labor under Obama, as a result of this, declared the issue unenforceable and ended up becoming a very public and vocal advocate for eliminating the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers altogether and having one fair wage, and has now gone around the country saying this. It's why President Biden has come out saying we just need a full minimum wage with tips on top. His executive order that for federally contracted workers was not just 15, but ending the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, because Biden was there during the Obama administration when they found that this doesn't work. And so, to the point of wage theft, listen, you're not supposed to be paid a sub-minimum wage if you're not interacting with customers. But the Restaurant Association not only has allowed that to happen, they've actually advocated under Trump, right before Trump left, they advocated to get rid of the protection for workers that if they're not interacting with customers, they need to be paid a full minimum wage. And thank goodness a new administration came in and stopped that stripping of protections from happening. So Selena, you and all workers do still have the right to be paid a full minimum wage, despite what President Trump wanted to do. You do have the right to be paid a full minimum wage if you're doing side work, if you're not interacting with customers. But it just points to what the Solicitor General under Obama determined, which is really this system doesn't work. We just need to pay everybody a full minimum wage with tips on top.
So Darwin Connor asks, are you worried that restaurants will start moving towards a no-tip policy? And if so, at least at many places in New York, especially bars, might that result in a reduction in income for many servers?
So we just haven't seen this happen in the 7 states with one fair wage. Honestly, we haven't even seen it happen in New York, where we raised the minimum wage for tipped workers from $3 to $10 over the last several years. Tipping has remained exactly the same over those last 7 or 8 years in New York. And it's remained actually higher in San Francisco is the city with the highest tipping average of any city in the US. California has had one fair wage for decades. Alaska is the state with the highest tipping average of any state in the US, and it has had one fair wage for decades. So actually the states with the highest tipping averages are one fair wage states. And so this just hasn't happened. As I said, I think it's as Professor MacKinnon said, it's a national, we have a long way to go. Let's start with getting everybody a full minimum wage. We've seen that there are no negative effects in these 7 states. And then perhaps the industry could move together towards more professionalism, perhaps in some instances, experimenting with other models. But right now, we have not seen any negative impacts on anybody's income. From the highest tip earners, the fine dining restaurant workers in San Francisco make more than they do in New Hampshire, to the casual restaurant diner workers, they make more than they do in New Hampshire as well.
Thanks. So we have time for one last question, and this is from Herschel Nachlis, who says, with respect to our senators' recent votes on this, might they be waiting for a different minimum wage bill to make it to the Senate floor, on which they might vote differently next time? I mean, I realize this involves a certain amount of mind reading in order to answer this question, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are about this.
Well, the Raise the Wage Act, which was introduced by Senator Bernie Sanders in the Senate and Bobby Scott in the House, is still the bill that is live. It's not dead. It never failed. It's still there. And rather than a new bill, I think what's happening right now is conversations around compromises. And I would love Professor MacKinnon to speak to this, but listen, I think we can talk about a lot of compromises on the Raise the Wage Act. We can talk about a longer timeline to get to a full minimum wage. We can talk about perhaps not having it happen immediately. Perhaps it starts later this year or next year. We can talk about, tax benefits and credits for employers. What we can't talk about, and I think we've talked about it this whole hour, what we cannot talk about is a compromise that results in a lesser wage for tipped workers at the end of whatever phase-in period there is, because of all the negative implications, particularly for women and people of color, and the life-threatening sexual harassment we're seeing right now. And frankly, we can't afford to do that because workers are saying they're just not going to stay unless this system changes. So I think, it's not that there'd be a different bill. It's that I think we need to talk about compromise. We need to get the senators to tell us what they want changed, but what we cannot change is ending up with a lesser wage for tipped workers.
Right. I just want to say that my experience working with legislation in general, that is absolutely the right position to be taken, because people are always trying to buy you off by saying, oh, let's just do a little bit now, and then some later time we'll be able to actually give you what you should have. And that later time tends not to come. So if it's phased in, that's fine, so long as when you pass it, you know that the time comes in which you get it.
Thanks. So we have 3 or 4 minutes for just final comments from either of you, Professor Jayaraman or Professor MacKinnon. Are there any thoughts you would like to leave us with?
Well, I would love to speak to the Dartmouth community and all of the students, especially, and faculty as well, but especially students. Many students at Dartmouth are restaurant workers. Many students in New Hampshire and across the country are restaurant workers. Our estimate is probably about half of all college students work in the restaurant industry. And so, we would love to invite you to get engaged, to learn more. Everybody can learn more and get engaged if you go to our website, onefairwage.org, and then /take-action. There's ways to get involved in the policy fight. There's ways to get involved in, talking with employers in the industry and workers. there's lots of ways to get involved there. One thing I want to mention, because Mother's Day is this weekend, is that there is a card on that website, onefairwage.org/take-action that you can print out. And if you take your mom out or you get taken out for Mother's Day, there's one card you can show to your server, which allows them, it's a QR code that allows them to learn their rights and get involved and know more. There's another card you can show the employer for how they can get engaged in being with Gail and many other great restaurant owners in terms of doing the right thing. So we encourage you to go there, and as a consumer also get engaged, talk with others, but we'd love to work with Dartmouth students on this issue. We'd love to engage, see if you'd be interested in volunteering or interning with us. We have a large internship program over the summer. And the final thing I'll just say is that I think it's important to note that your senators are 2 of 8 that have voted no on this issue. So the vast majority of Democratic senators have voted yes on this issue. And so New Hampshire is going to play a pivotal role on this policy. And New Hampshire will basically help answer the question, will we as a country end this legacy of slavery? Will we as a country finally provide women an equal wage and the ability to stand up for themselves when they work? Will New Hampshire allow the country to ultimately allow women to be valued as the skilled professionals that they are, and all workers to be valued as the skilled professionals that they are in this industry? So New Hampshire plays an important role, and I'm very happy to be with you all today.
Thank you. Professor MacKinnon?
Yeah, I was thinking about New Hampshire's slogan, live free or die. And, it strikes me that this is an example of maybe some people thinking they're living free, but other people dying for it, and that is not what it means, that it should be the same rule for everyone, and everyone should be equally free to live freely. And so I think the whole point of law actually is that no one is differentially treated. The small businesses that are worried about being disadvantaged by this, the point is everyone would be operating under the same rules. That's why you have law. And all businesses would be on the same ground. There would be no comparative advantage and disadvantage the way there can be if some businesses are operating according to ethical standards and others are taking advantage of them, and everyone's thinking, I don't want to be taken advantage of, so I'm not going to operate according to my ethical standards. Now, the reason you have law, I just mean to say, is so that you have the same rules for everybody. And, having a fair minimum wage, a fair wage for everyone that is minimum with tips on top would do that here.
Thank you so much, Professor MacKinnon and Professor Jayaraman, for coming to Dartmouth and talking with all of us and raising our awareness about this hugely important and timely issue. We're now out of time, and so I need to pass things on back to Joanne Blay, but I can't thank you enough. This is so informative, and really appreciate all your efforts in this area. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Brison, for guiding us through such a timely and interesting discussion. Thank you to Professor MacKinnon and Professor Jayaraman. We really appreciate you sharing your passion, your time, your expertise. It was you've given us a lot to think about, and especially with Mother's Day coming up, I think I know your timeliness, you were thinking about the bill, but on a practical level, Mother's Day is a great time to be thinking about these. Thank you all to everyone who's attended tonight. Next week, we will be hosting 2 events. The first will be on Monday at 7 p.m. when a panel of Dartmouth alumni will discuss working on social justice in your career. Our second event is on Wednesday, May 12th at 5 o'clock, when the New Hampshire Superior Court Chief Justice Tina Netto will be discussing drug court with Professor Shaiko moderating. Thank you to everyone for joining us tonight, and we hope to see you next week.